So this is a joint talk by myself and Andy Dunningham. We're both at SIAM. I'd just like to start with something that's in The Guardian today, just to set the scene. World close to irreversible climate breakdown, warn major studies. Key UN reports published in the last 2 days warn urgent and collective action needed as oil firms report astronomical profits. That's an interesting one. Just to set the scene as well, I'm talking about climate change in New Zealand's forests. We were asked, and it was a privilege to be asked actually, to talk about this, to talk about the impacts of climate change on New Zealand's forests, but I thought that would be extremely depressing. So we've actually opened it out to talk about the whole opportunity and what we can do to offset those impacts. So we're going a little bit broader, I suppose you might say. The other thing, it's quite easy to fall into a bit of gloom and despondency. There was a very good comment yesterday about the fact that we are all in it together. I'm waking up at 4 in the morning and thinking, what am I going to talk about? And yeah, is it going to be gloomy? You do need to try and keep the positive side of things, because there are some positives. So, we heard about biodiversity, biosecurity and climate. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to build a bit on James's talk. If that works. Is it the green one or the red? No, that one. There we're the huge green one. So I've advanced on James's 2 graphs and been efficient and put them into one. But New Zealand's forests are in uncharted territory. I mean, we heard from various people yesterday that, they've evolved over millions of years, but in the last few hundred, things have changed dramatically. And this is a real concern. How will they evolve or not? And what are some of the things we need to think about? I think just to put things in context, climate change there on the left. When we're looking at climate change and forests, there are basically 3 sort of areas that we look at. Obviously, there's the impacts on the forests, but then there's 2 actions that you can actually take to do things about those impacts: mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation's using forests to offset climate impacts, so that's planting trees. We need more trees, plant trees. I was pleased to hear that yesterday. And adapting forests. Adaptation is around, with existing forests, what we've got now, and how can we help them move through to their next state, because there are certainly some things that we can't actually do a lot of to help, but there are some things. So taking that in mind, we're going to talk a little bit about impacts, mitigation and adaptation. And when we were asked to do this as well, there's not going to be much in the way of data in this. We thought we'd have a look at what international things could tell us and where we could sort of learn from overseas to bring back to Aotearoa some ideas and some opportunities. So, looked at international trends, and what we did was as a sort of a bit of a sort of proxy, I suppose, for the development of thinking and activities around climate change. We looked at the number of scientific publications over the last few years and took it the last decade, and you'll see that there wasn't a lot going on earlier on, but things are ramping up. There's a lot more emphasis now going on. Scientific publications, there's obviously huge amounts of grey literature and reports and UN reports, IPCC and so on and so forth, but it's the underlying evidence base which is really important. So we sort of had a look at that, and you'll see there that impacts and mitigation are the 2 highest things, and adaptation was fairly flat and is sort of starting to increase now. People are starting to think more about adaptation and how that might work. And you've got COP and the Bond Challenge, looking at restoring forests. We heard about the Hawaiian initiatives just before. Lots of activities going on. So I'll just jump into impacts. We've heard about these. These are the main ones. I was recently at a meeting of the UNECE and UN on forest damage and disturbance. and a common refrain, well, these are the sorts of impacts you're going to hear about across all forests, right across the planet, to varying different sort of degrees. And you can see down the bottom there, if you want a quick summary of this, Jackie Amers put a paper together for Pure Advantage. It's on the website, which basically goes through and talks a bit about what some of these different components are and gives a nice overview. But we are definitely looking at fire, and the impacts there, because fires are becoming far more extreme, they're actually changing the ecology of the landscape. So in California, the forest that's coming back after the fires is not the forest that was there before. So you're actually getting changes in the ecology. Pests and diseases, as things warm up and get more humid, more fungi, more microbes, just generally nicer environment for pests and diseases, or invasive plants, things are going to move around, and definitely things are getting worse. That's one of the big issues, but that's the biodiversity, biosecurity, climate change trifecta. We've got to keep an eye on things so we don't let something in that could really hammer the forests. And drought is another major one. Quick pause. I'd just like to thank everybody who filled out our interactive survey. We thought we'd ask a few questions about climate change just to see what the group thought. One of the questions was, what did you think the forests would be like in 100 years? And we went from about the same to dramatically different. Well, 66% of people, or 64%, thought they'd be quite different or dramatically different. So we're looking at expectation of quite a lot of change related to a variety of impacts and so on and so forth. The second or third question we asked was, which of these impacts do you think might sort of be top ranked? Interestingly, we talked a lot about invasive mammals and things, and the big problems we've got with weeds. Drought came out at top. There was a few comments there about people concerned about drought. That was really interesting. It's not a scientific study. There's 63 respondents, but it was just interesting just to get a bit of a snapshot. But after drought, we had invasive mammals, invasive plants, then insects, then fire, then human disturbance, and interestingly, wind and rain, those storms, were actually lower down the bottom in terms of what people thought. Now, mitigation, which is next, can do things about storm damage, but not necessarily, people aren't too worried about storms in the existing forest. If we talk about mitigation, these are the new forests. These are forests we're putting in now, restoring the landscape. Some amazingly uplifting discussions this morning about what you can do, how you can do it, looking at changes over time, and everybody getting in and doing it together. And these forests, we've heard about ecosystem services, provide all sorts of different goods. Carbon's the one thing, but I think carbon's the lubricant which actually allows you to do stuff. If you get some cash from carbon, you can actually move on to do things. And Sean Weaver at Ecos, I think, likes the idea of, well, we'll do a bit of a mixture, get some money here, which allows us to do some native work over here. So these sorts of things are really important, and a lot of those things, spiritual values, the intrinsic value of the forest itself is, non-quantifiable, but we know it's really important, and it's about 28% of New Zealand. So existing forests, we want to increase those. How are we going to do that? Lots of challenges. We've heard about these as well. What to plant, where to plant it, why to plant it, what's the purpose. In some instances you'll be planting it for erosion control, other instances you might be planting it for recreation and tourism, or just because the ecosystem doesn't exist anymore and you'd like to try and sort of get some biodiversity back into the city. So a lot of questions there, and we've done some work under sort of current climates in the Hawke's Bay, or the Billion Tree Project with the Hawke's Bay Council and a whole raft of organisations. Looking at those two maps on the right are the sort of current environmental envelope of where totara and manuka sort of grow under current climatic conditions. In the future, if the climate changes a lot, they're going to grow somewhere else. So we need to think about that in the future when we're looking at things like eco-sourcing and, you know, what's the impact or implication of things changing, and also things like physiology. If we're getting lots of droughier days, you know, what do we do? So a couple of references down the bottom there for later if you feel like it. Adaptation. This is I think the big thing that we need to think hard about. Internationally, a lot of work going on adaptation. See in the middle there, the standard practice guide for the Forestry Commission in the UK. They've got a new national forest, lots of tree planting going on, and looking at how they can adapt their existing forests and look at new forests. And people are starting to develop resources and toolkits. Though when I tried to get the US Forest Service toolkits, I think potentially due to sort of changes in things, they're not available on the website at the moment. But there's a lot of interesting and useful stuff we can learn from there. In New Zealand, this is publications in New Zealand of forests and climate change. It's not split out by those three categories, and it's a little fuzzy, but it shows the same trend. You know, we're increasing on scientific publications in the area of climate change, and we are starting the journey towards adaptation. So you see on the left there, adapting to climate change, there was a technical working group. Things are included in the climate change risk assessment, which was done 3 years ago, the draft national adaptation plan, the emissions response plan, and I've got an example over there of the Department of Conservation's adaptation plan, which isn't focused particularly on forests, but you can see we're working our way towards things. What is quite interesting is that within the climate change risk assessment, they did a massive risk assessment of all the things across New Zealand that might be of concern under climate change, and things like coastal inundation and stuff way up there. They worked it, and this was big discussion groups, worked it under urgency and then consequences. What is interesting is that for forests, the urgency was actually rated quite low, and the impacts and sort of consequence now is insignificant, but moving through to 2100 becomes major. Now, there's two things you could think about here. One is that we got that wrong and it's actually, we need to do things immediately, or we might have a bit of a window of time to actually be able to work through things. And I'm suggesting we accelerate what we're doing now and don't wait, but anyway. In terms of our existing forests, this comes across internationally as well very strongly. A number of people have mentioned it. It was mentioned by the Minister this morning in that presentation around resilience. We need to build resilient forests. And when you hear numbers of 200,000 deer in forest blocks and things, those forests are probably not resilient. So there are some things we probably need to be doing now to really sort of boost the resilience of our forests to actually buffer them from the climate change side of things. And again, this up the top right there, declining forest resilience under climate change. The impacts of climate itself are knocking the resilience down. So a couple of science challenges, and this isn't everybody, but they're there as examples. You know, focusing on what you can actually affect. They're doing things, and there was a tweet just recently from the Deep South where they've been doing some local coastal adaptation workshops, and we're looking at toolkits to help people, communities, actually build their own sort of adaptation responses. We need the same for forestry, or forests. To develop a plan, pretty much that sort of thing. You start from the left, you've got your future climates, you've got your forest types, you've got your environmental data, and you do a risk assessment. Now, James showed that climate's going to change differently across the country. It's also that we've got different forest types across the country. So this is a spatial thing. So you really want to build yourself a spatial vulnerability matrix, and you'll be working locally to actually develop adaptation responses, which you then sort of start working on. So you end up with local, regional and national adaptation plans. And I think that's something, you know, if people are doing it, let's get together and all do it together. If we aren't doing it yet, you know, if there's one example here, can we learn from that, or should we sort of really accelerate this as well? So just in summary, and you see this lovely native forest here. That's my forest. Well, it's where I grew up actually in England. It's an ancient forest of oak and beech and a whole range of understories, and yeah, provides huge amounts of value to the housing estate and where I grew up and all sorts of bits and pieces. But yeah, I just thought I'd put one of my forests in there rather than just a generic native forest. It's been there for many hundreds of years, some massive trees. But just in summary, it is uncharted territory. It's really good to see this group. I mean, this is the biggest event, I think, in this area, probably in the country, ever. And there's a huge amount of work going on. So let's continue that. That's really, really good. But let's look at our existing forests as well as planting the new forests, because we've got to keep an eye and look after them as well as we can, because you know, they're the seed sources for new forests. They're also there in their own right. And I think we need to look at adaptation and how we can help them. Some ways we're not going to be able to help, but there are bits that we can do, obviously, things like pest control to increase resilience. And there's no room for complacency. That urgency level of 53, I'd be putting way up there, and I'd be looking to accelerate things as fast as we can. And the final thing, we can learn heaps from overseas. There's a lot going on. I'm sure everybody here is really well networked as well. But how do we bring that information in to actually help us do what we do? You know, with Hawaii, I've got really strong links into Europe, for instance. They're doing some amazing new plantings of mixed species, native species, across the whole of sort of the Atlantic seaboard to see what's going to work under new climates. So there's a whole raft of things we can look at. So that's me. I'd just like to acknowledge the organisers for the invitation,